Okay, so today we are diving deep into a really dense and honestly pretty provocative social media thread. It claims to connect a world famous designer, a billionaire hedge fund manager, and a convicted sex offender. It is a sprawling, complicated web of allegations, and our job here is to try and map it out piece by piece so you can see how the author puts it all together. So, how in the world does a single social media thread connect these seemingly separate worlds? That's the big question, right? It's the central mystery the source claims to solve. So, we're going to follow the breadcrumbs that the author laid out and see exactly what story they're trying to tell. So here's the game plan. First, we're going to meet the key players at the very center of this story. Then we'll dig into the thread's claims about a really controversial connection to Jeffrey Epstein through MIT. After that, the story just gets bigger, pulling in a major defense contractor, a whole wider network of people, and finally, we'll get to the author's explosive main claim that's supposed to tie this whole thing up. All right, let's kick things off with part one, the key players. According to the person who wrote this thread, this entire intricate web, it all starts with just two people. So on the left, you've got Oxman, a really celebrated designer and a former star professor at MIT's famous media lab. And on the right, that's her husband, Bill Ackman, who is a very high-profile billionaire hedge fund manager. The source basically argues that if you want to understand the whole story, you absolutely have to start with them. So the thread starts carefully building this profile for Oxman. It makes sure to highlight her family's connections to Israeli academia, her military service in the Israeli Air Force, and of course, her very prominent career at MIT. Each of these points is laid out like a crucial piece of a puzzle, and it's all leading up to the thread's main allegation about her, that her lab took money from Jeffrey Epstein. Now for Ackman, the source really hones in on his immense financial power and what it claims is his deep political access. It points to his controversial lobbying during the COVID pandemic and highlights a claim that he was in a private chat with the Israeli War Cabinet. These are the details the thread uses to paint this picture of him as a guy with some serious, extraordinary influence. Okay, part two, the Epstein-MIT connection. And this is where the name that casts a huge shadow over this entire narrative gets introduced: Jeffrey Epstein. Now, the source lays out this timeline, and it wants you to see it as anything but a coincidence. It's presented as a deeply suspicious sequence of events. So first in 2018, the Epstein-MIT scandal breaks. Then, early 2019, Ackman and Oxman get married. A few months later, Epstein dies in jail. And finally, in 2020, Oxman quietly leaves MIT. The author really wants you to ask, are these events connected? At the heart of this whole MIT mess is this number, $7.5 million. This is the amount the source claims MIT's prestigious media lab, where Oxman was a professor, got from Jeffrey Epstein. And it alleges these were off-the-books donations, deliberately hidden from the university. And yeah, the fallout from this was huge. It wasn't some little secret. The source includes this collage of headlines from major outlets like Bloomberg and The Guardian to really drive home one point. The money flowing between MIT and Epstein was a major, very public scandal. And here, the source makes what it sees as a really critical distinction. It claims that, yeah, Harvard also took Epstein's money, but they allegedly did it before his first conviction for sex crimes. The thread alleges that MIT, on the other hand, accepted millions after he was already a registered sex offender, basically framing MIT's actions as a way, way more serious ethical breach. Okay, part three, the Elbit Systems claims. Now, just when you think you know where this is going, the story takes a hard right turn, moving from the halls of academia into the high-stakes world of international military defense. So, a new name enters the picture, Elbit Systems, which is described as Israel's largest defense company. The source uses this post right here as evidence, making sure to highlight that the company was suspended by a NATO agency because of a major corruption probe. The whole point here is to immediately flag Elbit as this controversial company already under a cloud of suspicion. And then the thread drops what it frames as an absolute bombshell. And I have to stress, this is a totally unverified claim. It says, fun fact, Bill Ackman's wife is the largest individual shareholder of Elbit Systems. This is the direct line the source tries to draw to connect Neri Oxman to this embattled defense company. And you'd think that would be enough, right? But nope, this is part four, the wider network. The author then zooms out. arguing that this web is way, way bigger than just Oxman and Ackman. They're just the beginning. So, another name gets thrown into the mix, and you can really see the author's confrontational style here. Guy Rachmuth. The source immediately points out what it sees as a pattern. Just like others in this story, he's got connections to both MIT and Harvard. The thread then really zooms in on what this guy does for a living. You see these articles from MIT News and LinkedIn, and they describe his work on computer chips that mimic the human brain. But the source thread just boils all that down to a much more dramatic, kind of sinister-sounding summary. He builds brain chips. The next link in this chain? Well, it's a personal one. The thread reveals that Guy Rachmuth is married to Sloane Rachmuth, and just like that, another person is pulled into this ever-expanding network. So through Sloane Rachmuth, the thread makes a connection to an organization called BTAR. It shows this very provocative image from an account affiliated with BTAR, with the line, "If Zionists don't make it in Australia, Australia will fall." The source uses this to try and tie the entire network to what it portrays as highly political and controversial Zionist movements. All right, this brings us to the grand finale. Part 5, the main claim. This is the part where the author tries to weave every single one of these threads from academia to finance to military defense into one single overarching theory. So what's the big takeaway according to the source? Well, here it is. It alleges that all these individuals are connected. It claims they are part of a long-suspected treasonous network. It even slaps these labels on them: bioterrorists, financial fraudsters, and intelligentsia. But the ultimate and most severe accusation is that this entire group is working for foreign interests against the national security of the United States.